Welcome to the deep dive. We take your sources and break down the most interesting stuff today, putting. Specifically, ball launch. You've probably wondered about it, but, never really dug in. We've got research, even data from a European tour player about how that little white ball gets rolling.
Yeah, it seems simple, but trust me, the details can make a big difference in how you play.
Okay, so you mentioned launch angles.
Mhm.
What's the ideal range? The research, it says there's a specific one for putts.
You're right, it's between 0.75 and 2.5 degrees. That's the sweet spot. And anything outside that, especially a negative launch angle, it'll lead to inconsistencies. Think about it. The ball launches down, it could bounce or skip on the green before it even starts to roll smoothly.
Especially on real grass, I can see how that would affect accuracy.
Absolutely. And then add grain, the ball can get caught up even more, behave erratically.
So this research, it emphasizes that connection between shaft angle at impact and launch angle.
This is a key point for any golfer, really. Ideally, you want those two angles as close as possible for a consistent launch. I mean, to show you this, the expert used Quintic software.
Oh, to analyze.
Yeah, to analyze the stroke of, get this, a European tour player.
So even pros.
Even pros.
Wow.
Yeah. This analysis revealed the player was struggling with pace control and is directly tied to inconsistencies in his launch angle, all stemming from variations in his shaft angle at impact.
So even with good technique, a shaky shaft angle can throw everything off.
Exactly. It shows how important a stable and repeatable putting stroke is. Now let's switch gears a bit to static loft.
Okay, so the loft built into the putter head.
Right. And it might seem odd, but too much loft can actually mean a lower launch angle.
Really? Why is that? You'd think more loft, higher launch?
You'd think so,
Hmm.
but think about how the ball interacts with the grass. Too much loft, it gets trapped, pops up, instead of rolling nice and smooth.
I see.
The expert used a robot. They putted with putters of different lofts, from -3 to +6 degrees, to test this.
Hold on, a robot. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so it's pretty cool. They found a putter with 0 degrees of loft. The ball rolled forward right away, even with a negative launch angle. Imagine that. Launching down, but rolling forward immediately because of how it interacts with the surface.
That completely changes how I think about loft, so surface interaction is a much bigger deal than I realized.
It's more nuanced than people think. Even tiny imperfections, like grain direction or how wet the green is, can significantly affect launch angle, spin, and ultimately the whole roll of the ball.
So even with a perfect stroke, the green itself can mess things up.
Exactly. And there's this story about a tour player. He was struggling with pace control. Analysis showed he was hitting the ball almost 4 degrees into the surface.
Wow.
Yeah, that impact caused unpredictable overspin and, inconsistent results.
So he was basically burying the ball. No wonder his putts were all over the place.
Exactly. And this is where the expert's advice on the metal ruler comes in.
Okay.
When you practice on a perfectly flat surface, you isolate your technique and see the ball launch without the green influencing.
I see.
Then compare those putts to ones on a real green, and you see how much the surface is affecting you.
That's a great tip. I gotta try that. Okay, now on to something that caught my eye. This 75 RPM rule. It sounds complicated.
It is fascinating. It's about the limits of overspin from the putter. Research shows it can't generate more than 75 RPM on their own. Any more than that, it's the surface.
So if I see tons of overspin, it's not my putter, it's the green.
Exactly. It
It-
shows just how much influence that putting surface has.
Wow, this is making me rethink putting completely.
Amazing what a deep dive can
Oh,
do, right? We're
sure.
just getting started.
Okay, welcome back to our deep dive into ball launch, all about putting. In part one, we talked about, those ideal launch angles, shaft angle, and static loft, the crazy 75 RPM rule, and we started to see how much that surface matters.
And you might be thinking, okay, how does all this theory actually play out, when I'm on the green?
You read my mind. Does all this loft and launch angle stuff actually make a difference? Like in the real world?
Let's find out. So the expert, they did a live demo,
Okay.
3 identical putters. The only difference, they tweaked the loft for each one.
Ah, I see. So same putter head, different loft for each test. Smart way to isolate, see how loft really works.
Exactly. And the results, they were clear. With a putter at 2 degrees of loft, the ball launched at, roughly 2 degrees. Then they used one with 6 degrees of loft. What do you think happened?
I'm guessing the launch angle was around 6 degrees then.
You got it. And in both cases, the shaft angle was basically vertical. So, the static loft was the main thing driving that launch angle. But here's the interesting part. They tested one with -2 degrees of loft.
Negative loft. So the putter face is angled down. Did it launch into the ground?
Not quite, but it did launch at a negative angle. And remember that 75 RPM rule. The data showed over 90 RPM of overspin with that negative loft putter.
Oh, wow. So way more spin than the putter could make on its own. That ball must have been digging into the green, then popping up, creating all sorts of, inconsistency.
Exactly. This demo really brings those concepts to life. Static loft plus shaft angle, they have a huge impact on how that ball launches, how it acts.
Makes you realize how important putter fitting is. You need a putter that works with, your stroke and the greens you play on.
Absolutely crucial. And remember that tour player, the
Huh?
one driving the ball almost 4 degrees into the surface.
Yeah, yeah.
So they analyzed his stroke with Quinix software, and it was pretty fascinating.
Okay, tell me.
His launch angle was all over the place, a range of over 2 degrees. No wonder he couldn't control his pace. And his zero skid range, so the distance the ball travels before it's rolling pure, that was all over the map too. Lots of skidding and bouncing at first.
It sounds like the opposite of what you want.
Exactly. But here's the thing. His overall stroke mechanics, they were actually pretty good.
Wait, so it wasn't his technique, but if his mechanics were solid, then what was causing all the inconsistency?
It was the putter. It just wasn't right for him, his stroke, or the greens he played on. Imagine running a marathon in flip-flops. You might have decent form, but those shoes, they're going to hold you back.
That's a great analogy. So even with a good stroke, the wrong putter can really mess things up.
Absolutely. In this case, they tweaked his putter loft to match his stroke, and the results were incredible. His launch angle, it became consistent, his zero skid range tightened up, and his pace control, it improved dramatically.
That's amazing. Talk about the power of putter fitting. So, that metal ruler technique, I'm skeptical, but also intrigued.
I get it, it's a bit different. But remember, by putting on something perfectly flat, like a ruler, you take away any influence from the green. You see that pure launch, based only on your stroke.
So it's like a pure test, a controlled experiment for your putting stroke.
Exactly. You isolate the variable, your technique, and see how it affects the launch, the roll. Then compare that to your regular putts, and you start to see just how much the surface is messing with you.
That's actually really smart, to develop that feel, understand how your stroke and the green are working together. What else stood out to you in the research?
We've talked about it throughout our deep dive, but it's important enough to say again, surface interaction. It's a game changer in putting. The grain, the moisture, even the type of grass, they all affect how that ball rolls.
It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. A perfect launch angle on one green might be totally wrong on another.
Exactly. You got to adjust based on, the specific quirks of each green.
This has been eye-opening, seeing how all these things, launch, shaft angle, loft, the surface, how they all work together. It affects that roll so much, and realizing that even tiny adjustments can make a huge difference in consistency.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, right?
Yeah.
Putting, it seems simple, but there's so much going on underneath.
It's less about force and more about finesse and understanding.
Well said. And guess what? We're not done yet. There's still more in part 3 of our deep dive.
Yeah, stick with us, folks. We'll be back to finish things up and give you some final things to think about.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot about ball launch and putting, the physics, real-world examples, even some practice tips.
It's been a journey. From the basics of launch angles and all that to, that robot test and the tour player who changed his whole game just by adjusting his putter.
So, after all this, what's the big takeaway? What should we be thinking about when we're on the green, ready to putt?
For me, it's got to be that ideal launch angle range, 0.75 to 2.5 degrees. That's where you get consistent putting, predictable results. We've seen what happens when the launch is off, especially those negative launch angles.
Yeah, it's like the ball is fighting you, not working with you. All that bouncing and skipping, the crazy overspin, it just makes things so inconsistent. Exactly. And to hit those ideal launch angles, we've got to remember that link between shaft angle and static loft. They should be as close as possible, ideally.
Like a perfect dance between your putter and your stroke. Even a tiny change in shaft angle can throw off the whole launch, send the ball who knows where.
It's all about finding that sweet spot where your stroke and the putter work together, And that leads us to another big point. Putter fitting.
Right. Having a putter that's made for you, your stroke, the greens you play on, that can make all the difference.
Couldn't agree more. But even with the perfect putter, there are things we can do to understand launch better. That metal ruler technique, remember that?
Oh, yeah. I was skeptical at first, but the more we talk about it, the more it makes sense. Putting on that perfectly flat surface, it's like a science experiment.
Exactly. You see how your stroke alone affects the launch and roll, nothing else getting in the way.
And then you compare those putts to your regular ones, and you see just how much the green is messing with you. It's a great way to get that feel, to understand how your stroke and the green are interacting.
Speaking of surface interaction, that's a huge lesson from our deep dive. Even the tiniest things on the green, the grain, the moisture, even the type of grass, they can change everything.
It's like it's not just about you and your putter, it's about understanding the green, adapting to its challenges.
Right. The perfect launch on one green might be totally wrong on another. You got to pay attention to those little details and adjust how you play.
And that 75 RPM rule still blows my mind. The putter can only create so much overspin. Anything more than that is all about the green.
It really changes how we think about where overspin comes from.
Hmm.
We blame the putter when we see the ball hopping around, but a lot of times it's the green causing that extra spin.
So next time I see my ball bouncing like crazy, I won't get mad at my putter. It's all about that surface interaction.
Exactly. And before we wrap up, here's something to think about. We've talked about how surface interaction can be tricky, but what if we used it to our advantage?
Oh, you mean like using the grain to change how the ball breaks?
Exactly. Or even, trying different strokes to change the launch, to control how the ball rolls. It opens up so many possibilities.
It's like turning those surface things from problems into tools. Putting gets a lot more strategic, more creative.
Like they say, putting is an art and a science.
Well, that's our deep dive into ball launch and putting. It's definitely more complicated than we think, but if we get these principles, we can putt more consistently, more predictably.
And who doesn't want that? Happy petting, everyone.